So last time we went for what we called New Heart, which was a little bit of an excuse because we wanted to lay out, the full chronology of Augustine's early life, but also tracing, the interior journey, the big transformations of consciousness. This time our work will, in a sense, be a little bit easier because we're just focusing on this dimension of his mind. And so that is thinking of it in two respects. One, the really objective pole or objective method of understanding, which is what is the content of what Augustine took to be the truth at all these respective points in time. And then the second question is, as he was grappling with those truths, as his mind was being either taken away from dwelling in God or moving towards it, what constituted the kind of nature of that journey? When did he have to stop for rest? When did he find himself in a state of, near exaltation and joy? And how did it all, in other words, kind of work out for him? So we'll be keeping those both in mind. For those who were at the last talk, we had this map, and remember, Augustine is from the Latin world, so he's in North Africa and moving up into Italy. And for our purposes today, what we'll be focused on is his indwelling within the Christian worldview at the end, right? So his kind of prodigal return, and all the steps, the two major steps that lead him there. And the first is with his back turned to God, the time at which he was beholden to the sect of Manichaeism, a sect of which he was a member for 9 years, 9 long years for Augustine. And then his movement into kind of addressing the truth in a new way through Neoplatonism. So in the first part, we have the heresy of Manichaeism. Next, we have the philosophy of Neoplatonism. And finally, we have the sort of expansive, full religious consciousness of Christianity. His major movement into the faith, ultimately into baptism, happened right there at the top of the screen in Milan, beginning when he encountered St. Ambrose in the year 384, and then when he read the books of the Neoplatonists that brought him into a new state of mind vis-a-vis these questions that had for so long occupied him. So something to bear in mind about Augustine is that he was you could kind of call him a cradle Catholic, in the sense that in those days you wouldn't be baptized in your infancy, it just wasn't the custom, but he was brought up by a Christian mother, as we talked about Monica, a very devout Christian mother, who would give him a sense of the Christian life, Christian expectations, Christian morality. And so all along as he's going through this journey, he's not going along as one seeking something different from what he takes to be Christianity. So when he's a Manichaean, he thinks he's an authentic Christian. And when he's a Neoplatonist, he thinks he's kind of taken the high road of Christianity or something of that species. The other thing too that I want us to remember is that as much as we tend to consider Augustine to be a genius, right? And so kind of revere him for his intellectual capacity, this journey is not a matter of whether he has the intelligence to discern the truth, as in terms of like a sheer kind of IQ number or anything like that. Because really, if we were to give him, if there were the Bishop Robert Barron of his time who could put out a 5-minute YouTube video on what is the meaning of the Christian faith, what is the essential doctrine, that would have been enough at any point in time for Augustine to have the conclusions that he eventually came to. So we have to ask the question, what was going on here, right? There are intellectual propositions that he assented to, that he needed to come into, but all the while, what's kind of definitive, what creates the kind of pivots in his journey is this soul struggle that he's going through. And that's often, those are the kind of order of the dominoes that need to fall. Something on the spiritual level that can get him to come to accept the truth. And we'll see how that's mirrored through his intellect. Okay, so here I'm introducing a big term prudently, because it's the only one I'm going to throw out there. And the reason why I think it's good to start here is sometimes a novel term can have the effect of giving us a fresh picture of things, right? So many words we have that we could use that we've built up a lot of connotations and their mental images that come to mind. Augustine had that problem, that you can kind of deter us from finding what's really at hand. So there's a term a theologian uses called the Cosmotheandric Picture. And what Augustine is working with at each stage in the heresy of Manichaeism, in the philosophy of Neoplatonism, and in Christianity properly considered, is a different cosmotheandric picture. And what that is broken down into these three portions, right? The first word, the cosmos. So any belief system of whatever order, either in Augustine's time or today, answers this vital question. That is, what is the nature of our reality? How was the world, how was the universe created, and what are the substances? What is the essential form of the world that we live in? There's kind of a cosmic answer that's given. The second one is theos, or the divine, and that is that each religious system will answer questions about the divine, about whether there is a God. If so, who is God? What is God's role in the universe, right? Is God all powerful, or are there certain diminishments to his power? What is God's relationship with the created order? Has he just set into motion, or is he an active presence, kind of ministering and mediating the events in the created order? And the third is the anthropos, or the human. And you can see there's a way in which these are all interrelated, right? If we answer the question of the divine in a certain way, saying that, there is a God who guides our lives, then we have an answer about what it is that human beings are here to do, right? We have an essential relationship to God. We're headed towards a goal that's already set out in advance. So Augustine's gonna grapple with having different answers to these questions, and you'll find that he's satisfied in different ways, that at certain points his restlessness is spurred, and then at others he comes to rest, as he says in the Confessions. Just to take a quick kind of test case, right, an example that's not necessarily pertinent to Augustine's life, but so how would we do the cosmotheandric picture of like modern day material atheism, right? Our answer for the question of the cosmos dimension would be, okay, the universe came to be at the time of the Big Bang. It set off a number of processes that are governed by, kind of natural law, but have an element of randomness as well. Life comes into play, then consciousness, and so on. So that's the universe. For the divine question, it would be an affirmative no, there is no divinity, there's no God who orders our reality. And for the human answer, although there are varying answers depending on your form of atheism, often it's something like we are the creators of our own meaning. There's no intrinsic meaning in the world. There's no kind of path that we follow. There's no relationship to a divinity, to God, that guides us. And so we're kind of working with our own material and trying to figure out as we go along. So that would be an example of a cosmotheandric picture that is not of Augustine's time, not one of his concerns, but it will kind of get us going as he works onwards. Okay, so what was pivotal, absolutely pivotal for the entirety of his journey, was that he started off really determining that he wanted to pursue the road of philosophy, because he was sent to Carthage to study rhetoric, to learn essentially how to persuade other people with kind of scant regard for what the truth actually is. And at some point in his studies, he was passed this book, kind of a book on the syllabus called the Hortensius, which was written by Cicero, who's a great orator and Roman politician. And he's not so much writing a work of philosophy, but arguing for a life built upon philosophy. Because what he says is that, this life that we lead is so fragile, so prone to disappointment, to decay. Everything that we have at any point in time will eventually, kind of fall apart on us. So the only sure path to human happiness And this is another question that remains in Augustine's mind. How can we be happy is always in his, at kind of the base of his explorations. And so Cicero is saying the only security, the only kind of safeguard for our happiness is to follow the way of wisdom, to live a life built upon philosophy. And Augustine was, he just hadn't been capable, I think, of thinking in these terms before. And he says, all of a sudden I have this new consciousness of the goal of my life beyond any particular schools of thought. Because remember, in that world, you have, all these kinds of, this whole marketplace of ideas, a bunch of different schools kind of vying for your attention and vying for your loyalty, whether it be the Stoics or the Epicureans, the Neoplatonists, as we see, teachers of rhetoric, this kind of crowded field. And he says, well, what stands above that ultimately is the truth as such, almost a mystical vision of the truth. And what it leaves him with is a sense of the truth as absolute. That is to say, not split according to our appraisal, but standing above and beyond any particular approach that we take. And that's important for him in becoming a Catholic, because for the Catholic faith, one of our core recognitions is that there is an absolute truth. And starting with kind of the premise that Catholicism isn't a sect, as Manichaeism, what he picks up, is a sect, but it's a religion that has a universal basis. And so when Augustine is ultimately satisfied, he'll see that what he was striving after when he first read the Hortensias at 19 years old, had finally, when he's 30 or so, come to be bridged. There's finally a realization that, yes, this is a place where I can remain. So he was fired with a new enthusiasm. He says, finally, in his prayer to God, he says, finally, Lord, I had a new way of feeling, and my prayers to you changed at this point in time. So we can see this rewiring that's happened. And he reads the book, is excited, except there's one thing that's wrong for him, and that is that nowhere within the pages of the Hortensias does he see the name of Christ mentioned. And like I said, he was something of a cradle Catholic. He had this piety, this kind of like reverence from the time that he was a boy. And he wanted to find Jesus Christ in whatever road of wisdom he was taking. So what he does is he moves from the Hortensias to reading the scriptures. And it seems like the way that he presents it for the first time. And he is sorely disappointed by what he reads, because he read these translations in the Latin, which was kind of a word-for-word translation of the Greek. And he says, oh, Cicero is this masterful stylist. That gives me great pleasure to read these kinds of works. And now I have to work with the scriptures, and there's something that's kind of clunky, kind of wooden. It just doesn't go down well. And so for that reason, he rejects the scriptures. He was kind of, as he puts it, overcome by, this is in retrospect, he was unwilling to become like a little child, and because he was unwilling to take on that perspective, swollen with pride, he rejected, the whole biblical testimony out of hand. Kind of an interesting turn for him. But again, he'll see it as falling on this kind of pride, humility axis. And I think for us, if we're trying to come to terms with his rejection of the scriptures, it's different in the way that we will often access the Bible. But I can say that, an independently devised biblical reading plan will often disappoint, because we'll find that we don't know where to start or where we're going or how to interpret what we're reading. And that was the same thing that happened to Augustine. But we would say that he lacks, he put it in terms of humility, but he lacked a kind of docility to the truth. He didn't want to go out and seek any kind of teacher. He wanted to have it there for him in the same way that he would undertake any kind of intellectual enterprise. And so in that way, he closed himself off to the truth. And it was highly unfortunate, because then he ran right into the arms of this Manichaean sect, who he has no good words for the Manichaeans. He calls them proud, madmen, delirious, raving lunatics, essentially, speaking constantly of the truth, raving about the truth, but providing nothing less than a counterfeit version of the truth. And he accounts that the issue with them is, you know, for one, he rejects ultimately their whole cosmology, their whole way of thinking. But he says they came at me kind of serving up these dishes of glittering myths, as he puts it. And I would eat these myths, I would kind of ingest their doctrine, but I wasn't nourished. All the time I was longing for you, Lord, and yet I was receiving this food that contained no nutrients whatsoever. But somehow, you know, there's like this addiction kind of scheme to it, even on the level of the intellect. Like once you start getting down to being fed a certain kind of material that's kind of self-consistent, there's a way in which it all works into some kind of universal picture, you'll find that you can keep taking on more and more, kind of irrespective of the truthfulness of that. It's what we get with conspiracy theories and the like today. But just to go back and summarize what the Manichaeans were all about, yeah, beware as I'm laying this out. It is surprising, some of the beliefs that they held. There was precedent in the ancient world for kind of thinking in these big, what sound to us like cartoonish or comic mythological terms. But again, they saw the universe, this is the cosmic vision, as from the very outset being determined by a great cosmic battle between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. And so what had happened is this material world that we have had been essentially overtaken by the kingdom of light. I mean, by the kingdom of darkness, that is. And particles of light were dispersed, distributed throughout the world. And so it was a job of those human beings who had been awakened to the truth that the Manichaeans were constantly talking about, to fight for the liberation of these light particles. And it's the body of Christ that they're seeking to liberate. It's kind of that outrageous in a sense. The body of Christ was dispersed throughout the world. Any kind of light, which would be the human soul, light that would be in plants, in certain animals. The goal was to liberate that, to send it out. It would be when it was liberated through, you know, eating a certain kind of plant, through spiritual ascetic practices. This is why the Manichaeans were against sexuality, by the way, is because they thought that any time that you reproduce, you were bringing more darkness into the world, right? Another imprisoned soul of light, and they wanted to kind of put an end to that to the best of their abilities. And so anyway, you would liberate this light and it would be sent up into the Milky Way, and from the Milky Way would be passed along to the moon. This explains the waxing and the waning of the moon, because when the moon is waxing, light is being transferred to the moon until you have the full moon, and then when it wanes, it's being passed off to the sun. So the sun and the moon, for the Manichaeans, they weren't deities, but they were close. They were these kind of great beings that held the stores of light that had been freed from the earth. So for one crucial thing that needs to be mentioned is that for Augustine, one of the beliefs that really captured him that he couldn't get beyond is that in this conception of reality, evil is a substance. It has a kind of a power or a value or reality that we'll see that Augustine is able to overcome. Evil could win in a sense in the Manichaean belief system. So we can pose a question: why, you know, on earth did he go with them? We've seen plenty of evidence of his, you know, intellectual sophistication, his ability to be candid as he goes along, even his, you know, his prudence in all kinds of intellectual and human matters. But just to kind of tend towards a kind of answer, you could say, in the first place, remember we talked about the stealing of the pears, when Augustine and his friends break into a neighbor's property, take all these pears off the tree and just them into a group of pigs. So what he said is when I did that, what happened is that I had the feeling that I never would have done that on my own. Like, if not for my friends there with me, I wouldn't have been up to no good in that matter. So he feels as if he's kind of in on something. There's this secretive club that he's joined up with. All of the rest of the world is kind of in the wrong, and he finds himself in this tight-knit group that has a sure sense of reality, or so he thinks. And And so he talks about how, in the book of Proverbs, Lady Folly is kind of the personification of this group. She cries out from the porch, like, come and drink this sweet stolen water, eat the stolen bread. It was this kind of sense of being allured by the Manichaean sect. The other thing, so they would be then for us like the Freemasons, a group like that, like all forms of kind of secret society that live off of their secrecy. Moreover, they were kind of like pushy, aggressive people. You could see them a little bit as like the religious people or quasi-religious people who are in, city streets downtown, who always have a brochure to hand out to you and tell you that, you don't really know what the world is all about, and here we have these answers. And the interesting thing about that mentality is that there's often, from their end, a sense of having a total clarity, just kind of having the truth by the horns. And this is what Augustine saw with the Manichaeans. And from, looking at the Catholic view, like what would we say about our certainty about the truth? On one level, we can say we're absolutely certain. The Catechism teaches, the doctrine of the Catholic Church that we profess, and there's no doubt there. In another respect, there's not a fullness of access to the truth. So the Catholic religion depends on a sense of mystery, which isn't just to say like, oh, we throw up our hands. It's no, the very character of our reality is that we're only given so much information and so much knowledge. And any kind of knowing or full knowledge that we have has to be balanced with the stance of unknowing and a sense of our limitation. So for Augustine, the Manichaeans, I think, were somewhat convincing, because they would say each and every question you can bring to me, I can answer. And not only that, but we know exactly what is wrong with the Catholic point of view. We can tell you why, they don't have the right conception of evil. We can tell you why, we don't have these Old Testament scriptures with these polygamous patriarchs and these other people of dubious standards. And so there's a kind of scorn for all groups that sat outside of their purview, and they'd kind of wrap that web around you. And I think Augustine kind of fell into that. So there's a fullness of the captivation of his imagination. So he most definitely went through a process of burnout with the Manichaeans. He started to have questions, one, about their doctrine, two, I think, about the kinds of relationships that he was forming in that group. He waited for a while to ultimately meet this Manichaean leader, Faustus, and he had his kind of Wizard of Oz moment, where he at last recognized that this person who was supposed to hold all of the answers to the perplexing questions that he couldn't get answered elsewhere didn't have those solutions. But it was very difficult for him to see his way out of the sect. More so, I think, than because of these lingering misapprehensions, these lingering difficulties, was because of his pride. He kind of had to confront the sting of his error, how he had been so wrong for so long. And you can feel it running through his mind, all the people who he had denounced as a Manichaean, all the Christians he had written off, all the words, I'm sure he had sharp words for his friends who were kind of in the Christian fold. And you can feel him just kind of grabbing his head and contemplating, like, okay, how am I going to get past this? So it was a mood of depression, most definitely, that he passed through, and a mood of in which he bottomed out. He came to the absolute nadir of his resources and of his trust in the universe. I think that's an important thing to remember for people who have gone through a kind of belief system that turns out to be counterfeit or based on false premises or something like that. There can be a shattering of your picture of reality and the trust that you've built up, not only in other people, but in yourself. So he was at a point ultimately where he said he despaired of ever finding the truth. And he ends up as an academic skeptic, which is something that you can see kind of in philosophy departments today in the United States. We can't really know anything for certain. So the best thing to do is just hold all belief systems in a place of radical doubt. You can see how attractive that would have been for Augustine, because he had walked through Manichaeism. he had recognized the error of their ways. It was kind of like a relationship you'd get into where the person paints a certain picture of themselves at the beginning, and then all of a sudden you start to ask questions and you see the story they told about themselves starts to fall apart, all the chinks in the armor, all the fallings out with losing trust. But there are just a few kind of questions that remain, a few promises from the beginning of the relationship that you can't get over. So he ends up in this place of kind of nausea, of disappointment, and struggles to kind of carry forward with vigor at this stage. He describes it, the stage, as the most dangerous stage of his spiritual life, because the temptation here is to fall into a total kind of despair. No longer do you have some kind of truth, even an adversarial truth that you hang on to, that you just say, well, there's nothing out there, you know, there's no difference between different kinds of human lives, and what does it matter anyway? But he was fortunate enough, and he wouldn't see it as just good fortune, but he would see it as God's providence, to encounter three principal seeds of renewal that transformed his mind when he was at his lowest point. I had on the last slide, but didn't mention it, that you could see it kind of this journey, if we're putting it in pictorial terms, as having been through like one of those, you know, like one of those North Korean show cities where you walk in and all the trumpets are blaring and you see all the facades of these like amazing buildings, and then at some point you realize that there's nothing behind them. That's kind of what happened with him in Manichaeism, but his head was hung so low that all he could do is kind of wander out into the desert, and that would be academic skepticism. So he's there. He's actually signed up as a catechumen in the Catholic Church, not because he really believes in a wholehearted way, but because he recognized that he was starting to move towards Catholicism a little bit, and had the influence of Monica, and for other reasons it would be profitable for him to do that. But it was a little bit closer to like the kid who goes through confirmation because he knows his mom really wants him to, and he has no, you know, better belief system, so he says, whatever, I'm going to go ahead with it, than it was to a real assent to Catholicism. But while he's there, he goes and hears Bishop Ambrose speak. I talked about their encounter. He's struck by his kind of spiritual and intellectual sanity. And this is a stage that, you know, a lot of us confront, we'll see other people go through it as well. When you come into the Catholic Church, or even after you've been in the Catholic Church for a while, you're still left oftentimes with a lot of misconceptions. There are a lot of things that are said about the faith that aren't accurate. Like for Protestants, the big one would be that Catholics all worship Mary, and that's what you're signing up for. You know, for an atheist, it would be kind of conflating Catholicism with fundamentalism and saying, okay, to enter that church, you have to believe that the world is 6,000 years old, something like that. You don't. So he was in a similar place kind of for his time period. And once he starts to hear Ambrose speak, you know, go to St. Michael's and hear Father Ignacio preach a few times and see, you know, whether you disagree with the church in the same way you thought you did at the beginning. It was that kind of moment. And he came to adopt an allegorical reading of the scriptures, which is to say, he came to understand that there was a spiritual sense behind a lot of episodes that he had taken merely in a literal fashion beforehand, and what was driving a lot of the Manichaean criticism of the Catholic faith. So there's that. The other thing with Ambrose that kind of jumps off the page when you're reading about his encounters is he was perplexed by him. He was intrigued by him because he couldn't quite figure out what made Ambrose tick. And this is what you'll hear the St. John Society talk about, like in the words of John Henry Newman, the power of personal influence. And what are they speaking of here? Not just a kind of wielding of power, but like an irradiation of power in Newman's words, right? So it's not a sheer like charisma that we would talk about in terms of like a great speaker or a movie star when we talk about this personal influence, but there's a mystery, just as the Catholic doctrine is held with a certain mystery, the source of it being kind of greater than any name that we can give. So too with people who have taken on the Christian life. And so he's kind of in and out of conversation with Ambrose. He can't pin him down in the way that he, for instance, would pin down Faustus and say, this guy's kind of a fraud. And it drove him forward with a greater degree of trust. You know, Ambrose would not sit still in his mind. He saw there was a greater power behind his words. And the last, major source of renewal for him was encountering the books of the Neoplatonists, which endowed him with a fresh vision and finally allowed him to kind of jump over the fence and ultimately come into the Catholic fold. So what did the Neoplatonists teach him? There was that first issue that he had as a Manichaean, when they would be sort of proclaiming the falsity of Christianity. They'd look back at these Old Testament patriarchs and they would say, okay, look at their behavior, look at the fact that they take many wives. There's something here that just can't be compatible with a life lived in God. And so Augustine says, well, now that I see the way that Ambrose is reading these scriptures, and I can see there's a deeper meaning that's kind of concealed when we take them at face value. There's a full spiritual movement, there's a development, not only throughout the Old Testament, not only in the lives of these people's faith journeys, but from the Old Testament to the New. So he sees a kind of evolution from the old law to the new law, as St. Thomas Aquinas would ultimately put it. We see that God is all the time kind of instructing and disciplining these people's hearts to come into the fullness of the truth that lies in Jesus Christ. So there was that. And then for the Neoplatonists, at last he sees that God can be spiritual. And this is a huge breakthrough for him, because previously he could only imagine God as a material body, first as like a human body, like blown up, something like that. And then secondly, as a body sort of distributed out throughout the full cosmos, either in the full material plane or in the material plane and out into infinity. He just couldn't wrap his mind around a spiritual being. And the Neoplatonists believed in this God, right, who would kind of the one who would sit behind all of creation, very much like our God the Father. All that was good, all that was would emanate out from this God. He was present to all of his creation, but not in a material way. So Augustine said, I used to have to think that an elephant contained more of God than a sparrow, because I thought of God as material, and you're chopping up God into little bits or something. He says, now that I recognize that God can be spiritual, God can be present to all of his creation without being diminished to any particular being, to any smaller form, something like that. And the absolutely crucial turn in his thought was to finally, through the Neoplatonists, see evil not as a positive being also, positive as in just substantial, not as a substance, but as a lack. So he'd see evil, in short, as kind of like a hole in a shirt, something like that, where you don't want it to be there. It's like bad, you would like to stitch it up, but it's not anything in and of itself. So evil became for him understood as the absence of good. And the way he sees that is because in the Neoplatonic view, you have, all of the created order sort of flowing out from God, and anything that is from God is inherently good. And so all defects in creation have to do with a lack rather than something negative that sort of fights against what is in the created order. So he's made it more or less, right? Because the Manichaeans are in his rear view mirror. The Neoplatonists have inspired him, but still he has to make kind of one final rejection. And that is that he says, yes, I can work with the conceptual architecture of Neoplatonism. I can see, these Christian scriptures having so much in common with Neoplatonism. But the one thing that I cannot reconcile, that the faith of Christianity provides, is a God who became incarnate, as opposed to the view that any sort of spiritual movement requires an ascent to God. He says in Christianity, we see it just reversed. It's all about descent. It's all about Christ coming down to earth. And that's because there's a God who loves us, not just the remote God of the Platonists, but a God who gives himself to creation, coming down in the form of man. And for Augustine, this kind of acceptance is kind of this twofold humble acceptance. One, to accept that God can be humble, that God can come in a manger, if you will. And two, to have requisite humility to come to walk along the path of imitation of Christ. So he says of the Neoplatonists, they're too scornful to learn from Jesus because he is gentle and humble of heart. And so you've hidden all these things, all these truths from the wise and the learned, and you've revealed them to the little ones who match the humility of Jesus. He says very interestingly that God only draws close to hearts that are crushed. Only to the hearts of the crushed will God come close. So he says, the Neoplatonists, yes, you've got it right in some way because you've found the goal, right? But the difference is that in Christianity, you walk along the way. So you, Neoplatonists, are looking down from a wooded height and kind of pointing out all the sights, this is how it goes. But you refrain from walking along that path. You refrain from being assisted by Christ as you move forward, as the way is made wide by the presence of Christ, as he leads you along by the hand, all these kinds of things. So we as Christians are walking along this road of humility rather than just pointing something out as the truth. Okay, so where has he come kind of in conclusion? Looking at the fullness of his journey. He started with a perspective in Manichaeism that was carnal, right? That was all based on the material plane. And he kind of stepped up into a view of a spiritual reality and a spiritual God. But this didn't satisfy him. It was insufficient. It wasn't enough for his experience, and it wasn't enough based on what he read in the scriptures. And he saw that not only is reality spiritual, but what is most fundamental about it is that this spiritual reality is mediated by a personal savior. So at the end of the day, it's a person to whom we entrust ourselves that leads us along the path, right? And for him, thinking about the healing that this created for him, and I think it may be true for a lot of us. So not only does he have right doctrine at this point in time, which is the case, but he's also in a different relationship with other people than he had ever been in before, right? Because he's starting with Manichaeism, and he's in a world where, okay, the majority of people are just deluded, they're living a dream life, and here we are the ones who have kind of awakened to reality and know what's going on. So a very small set of people whom he could recognize as like him, as kind of brothers and sisters, traveling companions. Then into the spiritual world of the Neoplatonists, who their leaders would say something like, I've been at these rigorous disciplines, moral and intellectual, for years and years and years, and yet I've only made an ascent up to God maybe once or twice. So there's this kind of rigorism where God is cut off, right? There's not an accessibility. And so you tend then to clump together in these sets of other people who kind of get the picture, your spiritual elite, if you will, just as the Manichaeans had their own. But finally, by recognizing that the path that we're treading is a path of coming to this personal savior and is coming through our humility, there's a recognition that every other person is, at least potentially, no matter what their status is, no matter what their gifts are, my companion on this journey. They're accessing the truth in the same way that I am. Because for all of us, it's that step to humility, that becoming a little child, that opens our way to the ultimate truth. So his healing is a healing into communion, into community, into a recognition of a shared reality for everyone else who belongs to the body of Christ along with him, and in potential for everyone in the entire world, and that they're capable of recognizing this same mystery. So tracking back to the big term thrown out at the beginning, the cosmotheandric reality, right? What has he found for the cosmic, for the divine, and for the human? He's found, first of all, that through understanding evil and good in a new way, we live in a world that is just shot through with goodness. Whatever we see of evil is a good world that was blessed from and in its very foundation. And anything that is good, and may suffer limitations and defects, but nevertheless all that surrounds us is good. So he's healed in that way. And Christ becomes the key to this kind of full picture, Because before we talked about how you kind of have the interlinking, you say something about the divine, that implies something about humanity. You understand something about the cosmos, then God has to kind of fit into that box. Well, for him, look how we can kind of see all of it welded together, right? In John's Gospel, we talk about the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, through whom all things are made. So at the origin of the world, everything is created through Christ. Everything endures in Christ. Christ is kind of the cosmic guide and measure in that way. And then for the divine, right, Christ is the image of the living God. The image is not only an image of God that we kind of struggle to grapple with, but it's an image of God who has become man, who has joined our fate, right? So that humanity, the divine, and the cosmos are sort of intrinsically united in this kind of final picture. And there's a solidity, there's a unity with other people, there's a sense of kind of finally being able to rest in one's heart in piecing that together. So Augustine will say, you know, in looking at things that he had previously taken to be just purely evil and deficient, he says now, you know, Lord, even fire, hail, snow, ice, and winds, all these proclaim you worthy of praise. So he sees the created world as speaking of God, as the psalmists do, but lands on a final kind of criterion. He says, not only do these created things proclaim praise, but we need to do the same. So the Christian is the one who confesses, who lays him or herself down before God. And the Christian is the one who exalts God, who praises God in his or her heart. And that's ultimately the difference, right? The Manichaeans could never praise God because they would say that anything that was bad that happened despite me, right? It was another power in me. There's no point of confession in that world. For the Neoplatonists, they would never have the sense of relationship with the God who came down to them in order to confess. And so for Augustine, finally, in the renewal of his mind, confession is what reconciles his journey. And so it can be, I would say, for us.
All right, it's a time for Q&A, Michael.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. Maybe.
Oh, I'll stop sharing. That helps.
All right, well, thank you for taking us through St. Augustine's different belief systems and the renewal of his mind. So we'll go ahead and open it up to our audience. As a reminder, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you feel more comfortable, you can just type it into the chat and I can read it for you.
So since St. Augustine was sort of a cradle Catholic, was there anything in his upbringing that may have led him to go into Manichaeanism? Or I guess maybe he wasn't particularly well educated, so he might not have heard any kind of arguments against these sorts of things.
No, I mean, that's true. Yeah, the question of Augustine's education is an interesting one because there's the assumption that, you know, when we see what he was capable of, that he had kind of a full-bodied education from the beginning. And for him, it was almost, you know, his rhetoric, something of a trade school, right? It gives you intellectual cultivation, but is very particularly pointed. So I think, you know, I think he kind of reveals to us his feelings of rebelliousness, right? That even preceded going over to Manichaeism. I mentioned the episode of the stealing of the pears, you know, and where he's recognizing that there's this force in the human mind that is present in myself. I see it in myself, that is kind of perverse for the sake of being perverse. And so it was kind of a mix of, I think, a rationalization of this belief system and maybe a kind of youthful rebellion and wanting to stand outside of these established structures in much the same way that people today might consider, Catholicism to be lame or something like that, right? And so I need to go out and kind of explore, on my own terms, a different reality. And he was so, brilliant and verbally gifted that he could kind of spar with anybody. So I think his pride was sort of inflamed by the Manichaeans as he'd go back to his hometown and share these arguments. So yeah, and like I mentioned, the final point is that on one level, in the same way that fundamentalism satisfies us intellectually to some degree, he was intellectually satisfied because he felt like this was a comprehensive picture of the reality. Like, you name the phenomenon and the Manichaeans would give you the explanation. So I think he relished having that, and the sense of being able to go deeper, which was kind of an illusion, kind of kept the carrot in front of his nose as he went along.
I can ask a question if people are waiting.
Yeah, great.
Question for you,
Question. I can see her on my screen. She unmuted herself, looking ready to ask a question.
Who?
Jazzy, you do too. I know it says Izzy, and she looks like she was muting herself.
You have a question, thanks. Yeah, thank you for that talk, Michael. This has been so interesting. So you mentioned how Augustine's Manichaean years gave him sort of like a material conception of God or the divine. They referred to God as God. Is that right?
Yeah, so they consider themselves to be like the true Christians. So they'd see God the Father, yeah.
And I was just thinking about how book 1 opens, sort of contemplating God's omnipresence and presence in all things, and God as the source of all being, and he's like compartmentalizing God in really interesting ways that I think are really like prayerful and really beautiful to read, but like also kind of startling, because with like a Catholic background, like at least I would never have like tried to imagine more of God in like larger like things of that can contain more material stuff rather than like smaller parts of the world. So I wonder like whether that was like an activity of like do you think that was maybe just like a foreshadowing of his like philosophical conversion, like his conversion and like how he conceptualized God, or do you think those were still like concepts he was struggling with when he authored the work?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think for one, there's a reason why that prayer is at the very outset of the book. So it is, something of like a prayerful summary of what he's grappling with. It's sort of playing out these conflicts in a kind of compressed form, because he's saying things like, well, how do we imagine you, Lord, and how do we go on to seek you, and if you're everywhere, where do I look, and this kind of thing. For that matter, there's a great prayer from Saint Anselm, the Proslogion, at the beginning of the Proslogion, that kind of picks up that motif and shows us in this kind of awesome way, okay, where do we look for God? We as poor sinners don't really know where to begin. So I think that's kind of the first thing, is there is a humility in that. But yeah, I mean, this is 10 years later. In a lot of ways, his doubts have been overcome. There are people out there who continue to accuse Augustine of like harboring a Manichaean imagination. Maybe you're seeing traces of that. but definitely what I would focus on in that prayer is this kind of like escalation of his desire. Like maybe that's a current that you can see throughout it, of kind of moving from contemplation of God to a kind of deeper seeking, and then back again to wondering, and kind of all the while like stepping, you know, from side to side as he rises to a contemplation of God's presence. So I'll have to look back at that and look at the particular those points that you're making and see. I think that's one thing he's after is a summary of the book, summary of these conflicts, and then also a model of how we can sort of raise our desires up to God and question sincerely, you know, who is this God who I'm seeking?
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Brooke in the chat. Did other Greek philosophers convert to Catholicism? It seems they were so close to seeing God given Augustine's reaction to Hortensius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, a lot of, I mean, at Augustine's time, there were a lot of people who were kind of Augustine's profile, who were converting to Christianity. I mentioned in the last talk, Marius Victorinus, who kind of held this chair of rhetoric and was certainly familiar with philosophy. And so philosophers were coming to the faith. Pagans and astrologers were coming and burning their books in public. We can question the wisdom of that, but the point was that there was this kind of atmosphere, this current of wholesale commitment to Christianity at the time, of renunciation of the kind of past life of seeking philosophically that they led. The great person to speak of in the Catholic tradition is Justin Martyr, who preceded Augustine and converted to Christianity and saw Christ as much like Augustine, as like the true wisdom that he had always been after. And he went and taught in Rome. He continued to wear a philosopher's cloak, kind of styling himself as one of the leaders of these schools of thought, and preached Christ throughout. So there is a compatibility between this kind of seeking after wisdom and finding Christ. Even it was kind of a folk belief at this time that has since been dispelled, and it didn't take too long to get rid of it, that people like Plato and Socrates were given like the direct deposit of divine revelation, and it kind of got watered down as it worked its way through these philosophical traditions, and stuff got lost in translation. But certainly there's a sight line onto that, onto the presence of philosophy and the compatibility. Pope Benedict talks a lot about the Catholic tradition really taking off with the co-inherence of faith and reason, as that being providential, like Greek philosophy coming into contact with Hebrew thought and with the scriptures, and kind of carrying the faith forward into its, you know, more final form.
The next question is from Jess. Jess is wondering, can you tell me if St. Ambrose had a lot of influence on him, St. Augustine, for his conversion to Catholicism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he most definitely did. As far as the intimacy of their relationship, like some people want to make St. Ambrose out to be like a second father. I don't think he was ever quite that. He was too busy, he had too many pastoral duties to kind of dedicate himself to Augustine's development. But those two ways that I talked about, I mean, for him, Augustine was judging so much based on the standards that had previously occupied him, and thinking like, okay, as I walk in and hear these sermons, I want to see what kind of rhetorical gifts this guy, St. Ambrose, has. And so he was like slowly but surely won over to Ambrose's way of working through the scriptures. He would write him at multiple points in time. He went and took a vacation when he was trying to work out coming into the church, and he asked him, what should I read first, you know? And Ambrose tells him, well, read the book of Isaiah, because in Isaiah, what a lot of church fathers will call the fifth gospel, Christ is foreshadowed, and you'll see all that's to come. And he said he looked through Isaiah and just couldn't make heads or tails of it and had to put it down and return to it later. So he's a figure of guidance who's popping up again and again. St. Ambrose is a saint, not for his influence on St. Augustine, but for all that he did in the city of Milan, you know, his shepherding of those people, his standing firm even against the storming of his basilica at a certain point by a group of soldiers who were defending a heretical cause. So Ambrose had a lot going on, and Augustine was one of his one of the souls who was influenced by him, you could say, yeah.
I'll ask my question while people
Yeah, go ahead.
think of next. Okay. So you mentioned, you know, St. Augustine, you know, did work these different belief systems. And what struck me was that, yeah, his trust must have been shattered along the way. What do you think helped him repair the trust he lost, likely in himself and in others as he traveled his journey?
Yeah, nice question. I mean, I think what struck me most of all about his kind of eventual journey back into the faith was that it was precisely at the point at which he had given up on really finding the truth that he was visited by all these people and sort of came to these fresh perspectives. So there's an interesting way in which that is behind his development of doctrines surrounding grace. You know, Augustine is known as the doctor of grace, the person in the church who teaches that in the ultimate way. And so it was he saw it as these sources of renewal that came from outside of himself, from outside of his own resources. And I think that was what amazed him. God will work with us in that particular way, right? To give us the people, the gifts, the books, all these things that we cannot ascribe to our own powers, to our own searches, that we can't go back and sort of own for ourselves if we're being honest about our spiritual journey.
All right. Our next question is from Theo. And this question is, after his conversion, it sounds like St. Augustine has very harsh words for the Manichaeans. Did he have any desire to reach back to evangelize them with this new discovered truth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if we would say he wanted to evangelize them or if he wanted to warn the rest of the world off of the Manichaeans, because he was always engaging from the point of his conversion forward in these very public disputations with the Manichaeans. So one time when he's in Hippo, I can't remember if he was a priest or a bishop at that time, he invited this Manichaean, member of the Manichaean elect, to come and debate him. And the guy was pretty foolish to accept it, because Augustine kind of led him into this double bind that the Manichaeans couldn't answer. He says, so either God is omnipotent, right? God is perfect in himself and cannot be assailed by any evil, and by that estimation is God, that belongs to God in his essence. Or we have a situation in which God is imperfect. And then, oh, my connection is a little unstable. Is it kind of sounding funny, Jenzy?
My end.
It's okay on your end? Okay, cool. Anyway, so essentially he talked this member of the Manichaean elect into saying, well, either I have to concede on one end and say that God is imperfect, or I have to concede on the other end and recognize that he can be broken down by these forces of evil and therefore is not really God. And so the Manichaean walked away from this exchange with Augustine and said, I don't know how to answer that. I'm going to go back and talk this over. And apparently the crowd who was around was, because they were pretty brutal in those days, was kind of all behind Augustine, cheering and jeering this Manichaean. So he would write these disputatious tracts, he would engage in public debate. You can feel in the confessions that he was kind of seething at them because of what they did to him, but also because I think for him as somebody so committed to absolute truth, to recognize that truth betrayed, this form of teaching that calls itself the truth and isn't, there's nothing worse for Augustine. And he kept with it. And they were a threat to Catholicism in that day and age. They were a heresy that was kind of mobile and gaining adherents. So there was a period of his career where that's what he was after, kind of two major periods, the anti-Manichaean phase and the anti-Pelagian phase later on, which maybe we can talk about later because it has more to do with the will on our last talk.
I have a question about the Manichaeans. Are there any, or kind of what happened to them? And, have they like survived and morphed into something else to the common, into the common era, or is there something similar in our modern era that maybe isn't related, but is, still comparable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it took about a couple hundred years for them to die off. The one thing about, as kind of an active sect, the one thing about the Manichaeans is that they were imperially opposed. So like in North Africa in Augustine's time, like you lawfully could not belong to the Manichaean sect. So that did a lot to kind of diminish their numbers, although the temptation to belong to that kind of insiders club was still there. And there was kind of a triumph of Christianity in that region of the world in that time, but they had a purview into kind of parts of Asia, so they were widespread for a while and did eventually die away. What a lot of people will say about the Manichaeans is that they're kind of given over to what is like the ultimate heresy, which is some form of Gnosticism, which reappears in each and every age. And that is this strict cosmic dualism in which, matter is evil and all that is spiritual is good. So the first Gnostics were a couple hundred years before the Manichaeans. And I think there are definitely movements out there today that we could identify as Gnostic in their origins and in their, belief systems. And really what it amounts to is belief in a salvation that has to do with either casting off the fleshly reality and often casting off community and belonging, and a privileged set of information that only some people are given. So it's been called kind of the constant heresy. I mean, I would challenge anybody to see if they can think of something that has kind of either an explicit Gnostic emphasis or Gnostic overtones. But they're out there.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. Okay, Jenzy. Well, we can, if there are no more questions, we can wrap up.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. And I think you're going to give a couple of closing thoughts, perhaps.
What I have planned, I mean, I was thinking that that could be kind of the exercise that's useful for our faith lives, right? To consider belief systems that fall outside of the Catholic faith and consider their usefulness. Because what Augustine's teaching, essentially is that there are some things that we have to reject out of hand and that we can kind of do nothing with. That would be Manichaeism. There are other things that we can work with that can kind of influence and inform our faith, and that would be Neoplatonism. So kind of thinking about just for this next week as you roll around whatever, whatever your world happens to be, think about different traditions, belief systems, people and events that you're exposed to under that rubric. What out of fidelity to Christ do I have to reject entirely? And then the delicate and more nuanced question, what can I use and adapt to my own Christian worldview?